Hello, everybody!
Turn this up in my headphones, Charles.
Turning it up? Hello, everybody, one and all. Welcome to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast. My name is Charles, and with me today, as always, is my lifelong friend and co-host, Dylan.
I'm ready to talk some fantasy with my friend, Charles.
I am ready to talk some fantasy with my friend as well, Dylan, and not just any fantasy today, because we've got a new segment alert. Woo, woo, woo. New segment,
Is that
guys.
the sound? Woo, woo, woo.
Woo, woo, woo. It is now, because, here at the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast, we're always putting our heads down, thinking of how to deliver the freshest, hottest fantasy content out there to you guys, and all these new different ways in which we can do that. And well, we think we've come up with yet another winning idea for a segment here. Isn't that right, Dylan?
Yes, we do. And I'm super excited to get into this idea fresh out of the FTF lab where all these ideas are spawned. Yeah, the FTF lab looks like all the other FTF stuff, which is mostly a Zoom call and occasionally text message exchanges.
Yeah.
But yeah, we cooked this one up in the lab, and we've got some exciting stuff with fantasy spin-offs for everyone here. Charles, would you like to introduce the segment and what folks can expect?
Yes. So, fantasy spin-offs. I mean, guys, this is exciting. We're going back to some of our favorite trilogies, some of the most popular fantasy series in the game, and we're looking for new perspectives in those stories. And we're basically pitching, like, what would be our, ideal or an interesting idea for a spinoff of a popular fantasy series. And I know we've got two series in mind today, and I'm just going to say we're going to start out big with the Lord of the Rings, guys. Lord of the Rings spinoff, we're talking about it today. And then we've got another one cooking up, right, Dylan? Another one of a series near and dear to our hearts and to the hearts of many fantasy fans out there in the world.
Yes, it'll be the Kingkiller Chronicle by Patrick Rothfuss that we'll get into afterwards. So the way that we're going to do this is when we're talking about the Lord of the Rings, we will not hold back from having Lord of the Rings spoilers. That would be... Yeah, we just don't want to constrain the conversation, and it's hard to do this spin-off question in detail without letting ourselves just talk about the things that happened in that story. So if you do not want to have Lord of the Rings spoiled for you, then now is a good time to turn this down in your headphones.
Well said.
We will, after we're done talking about Charles's idea for a Lord of the Rings spinoff, which I haven't heard yet, by the way, so I have no idea what's coming.
No.
Charles knows exactly what I'm going to say for the Kingkiller Chronicle.
Yeah, but
so do you, dear listener, probably. But...
Right. I'm still excited to see where you're going to go with it. It's the execution of the idea that I have not heard yet, and I'm excited to hear you talk about when we get to Kingkiller. But as you mentioned, Dylan, we're starting with Lord of the Rings.
Yes, and I want to give a heads up that during the first, let's say, half of this podcast, while we're talking about the Lord of the Rings, we will not spoil anything from the Kingkiller Chronicle. And when we transition toward talking about the Kingkiller Chronicle, then I will give you a heads up and say, hey, we're getting into the Kingkiller Chronicle now, and it's a good time to turn this down in your headphones. Don't want that spoiled, but don't worry yet if you're worried about that, because we've got some great Lord of the Rings talk to get through before we get into the Kingkiller Chronicle. You'll be warned. You will be warned.
If you're excited to listen to a spin-off idea for Lord of the Rings and you have not read Kingkiller, you're in the right place.
Yes.
Guys, you are in the right place, and you will get plenty of warning before we get into all the delicious spoilers of Kingkiller Chronicles. But for now, let's not delay any longer, and let's get into the spin-off idea. Now, Dylan, the Lord of the Rings, right? I mean, it's the Lord of the Rings. It's the most famous work of fantasy there is. It is the genesis of modern fantasy. It's one of the most influential works of fantasy ever written. And I think we've come so far, I think. And we're now in a modern age, and we're looking back on the Lord of the Rings, and we still love the Lord of the Rings, of course. But there's many things about it that we would be interested to see brought into the 21st century. And what better way to bring Lord of the Rings into the modern era and to introduce it to modern trends in fantasy, modern tastes in fantasy, than a good old-fashioned spin-off. And old-fashioned spin-off. And one of the things that I always think about with the Lord of the Rings is everyone is the most legendary version of their race, and they have the most legendary weapons, and they're fighting the most legendary villains. It's a lot, right? And it's epic, which is fantastic. But the spin-off, right? I think the magic, the charm of a spin-off is that we can tell a smaller, more focused story, a more humble story with a more humble character. And honestly, I'm pitching we write whole new characters set at the same time as the Lord of the Rings trilogy is going on, and we get a new perspective of how these huge sweeping characters that, change the shape of the world affect the common man. I'm thinking, imagine a saga-like story that takes place in Saga Comics,
yes,
which is sci-fi fantasy. Brian K. Vaughan, Fiona Staples, which we love, and that's a story about family that takes place in a Star Wars world, essentially. But that's very oversimplifying it. But just to get you an idea of what's going on.
Yeah.
And so this would be a family in a Lord of the Rings style world. So they're not trying to throw the ring into Mount Doom or anything. They're just trying to survive. And there's orcs running around and goblins running around. There's elves and men and dwarves running around. And they're just trying to find peace and a home in this chaos. And I think it would be funny to have these spotlight scenes. You pull in some of the A-list cast, but yes, they bring armies with them, but they uproot these families' lives and cause them to have to move. It's we have to go to Helm's Deep now or you're all going to die. And then they're in Helm's Deep and they're we're going to die now. This is crazy. Why do we ever come here? And then they go to, Gondor and things like that. And we get to see this human side of it. We get a modern perspective, and we get a new perspective of a family. We can get, children, husbands, wives, whatever, and just see the same story, but through a whole new lens. And to me, I think that would be super, super interesting to get a new perspective on the same story, where it's you kind of know where we are in the timeline from choice scenes that we recognize from the original trilogy, but we're getting it told in an entirely new perspective. And I just think that would be fresh and exciting.
I'm really interested by this idea, Charles, because it appeals to, and good on you for thinking about it. I can tell that saga inspiration is near and dear to your heart. Mm-hmm. I know you know it is to mine too. And I like it. I think it's It's an exciting idea for a few reasons. And the one that most appeals to me is, I'm into these morally gray characters and fleshing out the depth of of these people that in Lord of the Rings oftentimes are just seen as all good, just outright heroes.
Mm-hmm.
And I like how you could bring almost this more well-rounded view to characters that are extremely well established if you make the way that the heroes are interacting with this common family that you're proposing would exist, actually make it seem like, oh wow, like Aragorn has actually displaced this family or something like that, right? Like he did it for the right reasons. Of course, he's just, he's making Middle Earth a better place. But for this particular family, all of his epic heroism just made them have to leave their home and adapt to a new environment. It's hard in all of these ways. And maybe they just hate him.
Yeah.
And you understand why they do, even though you also understand that if he didn't take those actions, he would be doing the wrong thing, right? Things like that.
Yes,
I think
exactly.
are just super interesting.
And maybe it's even like, maybe Aragorn big times him a little bit more than that. Maybe it's like a sergeant who's like, oh, like the King of Men has returned and he decrees that we must all like march this way, and you're like, who is this guy? Like, because there's
King of Men.
Yeah, because it's like, I've never seen him. I don't know who he is. He's like, I didn't vote for him, like Monty Python. It's like, you don't vote for kings. So yeah, it would be something like that maybe, and then you spice in a few appearances. But I almost like the idea of the implication of these characters, these main characters, Gandalf, Aragorn, Boromir, or whoever, are affecting them, but you see it almost like a reactionary effect, where it's like, oh, because they did this, that means we have to do this, and we don't even know who they are, right? And they don't know who we are, and it's this interesting cause and effect relationship in the Lord of the Rings universe, and we get to see all kinds of cool things along the way, and we could even see the return. We could bring more characterization to the ruffians, Dylan. The ruffians can make an appearance, and they're gonna be extra, ruffian, but we'll understand why. Maybe one of these characters acts like a ruffian. I don't know.
Charles, this is such a deep cut FTF lore.
Yeah, you have to go back like 100 episodes.
Yes. Yeah, it's like, go back to our Lord of the Rings buddy read episode for, what was it, Return of the King? I guess that had to be right. And you'll hear Dylan be at wit's end with the ruffian aspect at the end of the entire trilogy that feels tacked on to him.
Right.
Yeah. I doubt. I actually wonder how many of our listeners, even who like are well acquainted with Lord of the Rings, are, know the reference to the ruffian part.
Yeah, that's a deep cut, but it's one that we can bring redemption to Lord of the Rings in a few ways with this series, And go for it. Go. No, you go for it. I'm done.
Yeah, I like the idea too with how Gandalf interacts with folks, because we get this sense in the Lord of the Rings, even just the books as they are, that the way that most people perceive Gandalf when he swings by town is like, oh no.
Yeah.
Not this, like...
That's so true. Like Denethor was like, you think you bring wisdom, all you do is bring trouble. Like when you're here, it just means we're gonna have to do stuff now. And it's never good. It's like we have to like fight Uruk-hai now. Thanks a lot. So it's true. And that could be the theme of this story. And it's told on the shoulder of the giant that is these characters in Lord of the Rings that are so virtuous and good that we all know and love. And it's this unique opportunity to tell a smaller story about family and how potentially powerful figures that mean the best still have to make these decisions that they can't foresee every consequence, and for that one person in 100, it ends up being bad or whatever it is. But I think there's a theme in there that is super interesting. And then to just point and be like, oh, I know where that is in the timeline of Lord of the Rings. How fun. I recognize that scene. I recognize that character. It could be a good time.
I think it could too. I actually am really excited about this because it leans into the kind of things that I'm interested in about the thing. Okay, I enjoy Lord of the Rings. I like it. It's not my favorite series of all time by any means. I think a lot of the things that make it a lot of people's favorite series for good reasons, like really incredible world building and these epic stakes of just good versus evil, they just don't lean as well into my subjective tastes as they do into some others. And I think that this gives us the chance, and I like more personal stories in a lot of ways too. You know, where I'm going to talk about the Kingkiller Chronicle, and that's a much more personal story than Lord of the Rings in so many ways. And I think that it takes all these amazing aspects of Lord of the Rings, like the world building, and allows us to keep those while then moving us toward the ability to tell a more personal and intimate story in this incredible world that J.R.R. Tolkien has crafted. And I love the idea of almost these cameos from people like Gandalf and Aragorn and Boromir, whoever else is, or Frodo shows up for a little bit, Sam, whatever.
Right? Merry or Pippin, maybe.
Not their story. Oh, yeah. It's not their story, though, and that's what allows it to be so focused on this theoretical family, or you could do a story about friendship or I know this isn't what you were pitching, but a romantic relationship or whatever. Like I'm a love story.
To all of it. Like the characters themselves, that we can get there, but you touched on the reason why I pitched it this way, because it's not so much about telling a story about a specific character as it is about taking Lord of the Rings and finding a way to tell that story and appreciate that stuff in the modern world for more modern audiences. Because I don't think you're alone when you read Lord of the Rings and you put respect on the name. That's another deep cut. Put respect on the name, and then you're like, but, you know, I've read Rothfuss, I've read Abercrombie, I've read Sanderson, and I just have a hard time looking back that far. And so this is like, hey, well, now it's plopped right here in front of you. The voice is very modern. And if you choose to tell a family story or a friendship story or something, there's potential for all of it. And that's what's exciting to me. I think the more interesting thing is that it is a nuclear story in a world where there are epic characters. Yes. And the epic characters are playing out in the background of the setting. Yeah. And you're like, oh, that character is like charging out onto a field and shooting light out of a staff. Like that can only mean trouble for us, something like that. Or I had this thought just now, Dylan, how funny would it be if somehow these nuclear characters or these modest characters get caught up in like a fancy banquet or something and they're eating and all of a sudden a character just starts singing and they act confused. And they're like, what, you're singing? We're in the middle of dinner. I have to stop eating now and listen to this? It's like, oh, it keeps going. It's in a language I don't understand. Like, what is that? Yeah, it's like, I can't. Elvish. I don't speak Elvish. Just be the voice of the audience, the voice of the readers. It could be a cathartic experience for a lot of Lord of the Rings fans, too, I would think. So, yeah, that to me, it's an exciting idea, and if I was gonna make that was why for fantasy spin-offs, guys, first episode of the series, gotta start strong. Lord of the Rings.
I think it's brilliant. I love it. Because I mean, that's the thing is it's like sometimes I talk about the world building stuff like I don't like world building. I love great world building and things like that, and great settings. I just think the thing that I don't like is when it is, and this is just me personally, it's okay like this, world building for world building's sake. Mm-hmm. And I think that all that world building has already been established so well by Tolkien in so many different places that now we can just use it as the background to this more intimate story. Right. I just love the idea of that catharsis of looking at these things through a more modern lens, right? And oh God, it's so cool. I love it. So what, Charles? Yeah.
I just also, to build on that, it's like I also love the idea, and I haven't read a lot of this in fantasy, where there's heroes, but they're like they're like forces of nature almost. And you're like, oh God, it's one of those hero characters coming through town. You know, it's like how many times in fantasy do you have like the King Arthur character come through and then the peasants like trying to survive his shenanigans? You know, it's interesting, like the traditional protagonist of a fantasy story being an elemental force that has not always the most virtuistic consequences in his actions. So it's just like what these characters leave in their wakes, kind of, which is the part of it that I also find to be incredibly interesting. And what better characters to leave these wakes than like characters from Lord of the Rings? Like these are the most virtuistic, world-changing, basically deity characters you can have. So that's the other like strength of this pitch. It's like has that been done before? That's like exciting actually to consider, like what is a hero in a fantasy novel. It's
I'm upset very modern. No one's doing this, Charles. Because I'm like, now this exists in my head as a thing that could be, and I'm like, this is your brainchild, Charles. How do you make it actually something possible? I don't know. Probably not feasible for us. But
I acquire the licensing rights to Tolkien's work.
Yeah, of course. We'll just take that out of the FTF non-existent funds. Right. I think that. Okay, Charles. Though this is very far away from having the chance of being reality. If it were to become a reality, would you want it book form, TV form? Would you want it on the big screen? What are you imagining? Miniseries. What are you imagining here?
I mean, multimedia phenomenon would be ideal, but I was thinking of these as books. I think they're too deep cut. But movies would be interesting too. I mean, come on, the movies are iconic for Lord of the Rings. Miniseries, I think that's a very modern form of delivering a fantasy story, so it might fit really well juxtaposed against the kind of story it's trying to tell. It's trying to be a modern story set in a old-timey world. So man, that's tough, because for me the issue with doing something that's on film is you'd have to show the characters, and you could like digitally insert a face on someone, but that never excites me all the way. I'm like, oh, a digital face on a human's body, like, okay, whatever. So maybe it would be great as a book, and it would be great as a show too. It's just you got to be mindful. Maybe you just only see like the back of Gandalf's like white head, and you're like, oh god, not him. Like you just see the silhouette, the little pointy hat, and you're like, oh
no, yeah.
You never see the face. Like they could go. There's ways to do it. I'm open to both. I was thinking book, but it would be a great miniseries too.
Yeah, we tend to default to book on here anyway.
Yeah,
but I think you're right about the idea of having to digitally render these characters or whatever. There are things you could do as a fun way to play around with it, but to keep it realistic, and you have to be realistic about these things, as the great Logan Ninefingers from J.R.R. Crombie's work likes to say.
Yeah.
And I think being realistic about it, a book probably makes the most sense. But you know what, Charles? I would read it. I would definitely read it.
I would read it too, and it's got me thinking it doesn't even have to be Lord of the Rings. Just write a story about a character trying to live in a world where heroes are out there making all kinds of ruckus. And it almost like lampoons the traditional fantasy story. I don't want it to be like over the top satirical. I do want it to be a little more complicated than that, but I think it could be great.
Yeah, I think so too. I think that Saga Comics is a great model for it, and if y'all haven't gotten the chance to check that out, it's highly recommended from both of us.
Yes.
And I think that it's, I think it's something, I don't know, we can save it for our next Friends Creating Fantasy there, Charles, if we get the right opportunity to, because it does it, you're right, I think it is added to by having these iconic Lord of the Rings characters actually there in the back. Because it's like, I don't know, these characters, iconic is the only word I keep circling back to. It's like, you see Gandalf and it's Gandalf. And that's so much more than, you could do with just a wizard that's a Gandalf type.
And you know so much more about the backstory. Like, anyone that knows the story of The Lord of the Rings would be like, oh, well, I know they did that for virtuistic good reasons, and I know that whole story. There's some magic to knowing the whole story, and I'm doing that in air quotes, like the main story with these heroes, the epic quest, and then seeing like the modern, smaller tale being told in the backdrop of the epic quest going on tangentially at the same time. So having an established work like Lord of the Rings helps in establishing that very quickly. You don't have to write a whole backstory. It's there already.
Right, and in a different way, that kind of reminds me of some of what we see from Joe Abercrombie's standalones.
Right.
And we won't spoil anything or go into detail about, but there are some ways in which characters from the original trilogy, it's in the same world, so it's not shocking that characters from the original trilogy might show up in some ways, either play bigger roles in the standalone than they played in the original trilogy, or play smaller roles, and you kind of have this overarching world that you feel like you know the people and the characters and what's going on for them, and even if you just see a glimpse of them, you're kind of like, oh, that's what's going on behind the scenes here. Right. And there's something special about, I just always get I don't know how to describe it. There's just like something fulfilling about the idea of like, oh, I kind of know what's going on in that guy's head, even if I'm not in his point of view. Yeah,
Abercrombie's way of world building through these standalones is certainly an inspiration for this story. That's well said. It's a unique way in which you use or don't use or mention or don't mention certain characters after reading a whole trilogy that adds a little bit of these Easter egg moments that improve the experience of the story. And that's what going through a story like Lord of the Rings would deliver value to the story, that the spinoff that I'm pitching right now. That's well said.
Yeah. That's awesome, Charles. This has me really excited and honestly a little bit insecure about my own, because I don't have some cool, amazing pitch for this. I don't know, Charles. You were like stepping up in front of Hollywood execs or whatever, being like, "Let me tell you my amazing pitch for a Lord of the Rings." It could be then miniseries or whatever, and you had this whole thing prepared, and mine is just like, hey, Dylan, what do you want? And I just was like, I know. But I didn't like prepare some sort of big thing. But are you feeling good on yours, Charles?
I'm feeling great. I'm excited to get into yours. You're trying to downplay it, but this is one that I also feel very strongly about. And before we get into it, I think it's time for that disclaimer.
Right. Yeah. So we're going to get into my idea, which is for The Kingkiller Chronicle by Patrick Rothfuss. If you haven't yet read The Name of the Wind and The Wise Man's Fear, then it's possible that we're going to spoil stuff as we talk about this. It's very probable, in fact. So from here on out, you've been warned that there will be spoilers for The Kingkiller Chronicle. And if you don't want that to happen to you, then now's a good time to turn this down in your headphones.
Well said. And if you've listened up to now and we're parting ways, thank you for listening. And check us out on Twitter at the FTF Podcast with a number 1 at the end. Yeah. And goodbye. But for those of you sticking around, welcome. We are getting into spoilers now for the Kingkiller Chronicle. So Dylan, let us not delay any longer. Come out and say it. What is your proposed Kingkiller Chronicle spin-off idea?
I think I already talked about... Sorry, this is probably not good, but I think I talked about a little bit in the 100th episode, and that kind of put the idea in our head. And another... I had a friend, too, named Matt. Hi, Matt.
Hi, Matt.
Yeah, you know Matt. Yeah.
Yes.
So he kind of brought up this idea of the spin-off thing. And between those two things, I was like, okay, I really, really would like a standalone story that is the Kingkiller Chronicle from Denna's point of view. This is going to surprise no one.
You said it.
I talk so much about Denna on here. Yeah, so you're probably aware, unless this is like one of your earlier episodes listening to the FTF podcast, or you haven't heard us talk about Kingkiller, one of my favorite characters in all fantasy is Denna. who is, as you know, if you're a Kingkiller fan here, or Quoth's love interest is probably fair to say, even though not much of a romantic storyline has developed between them. There's obviously lots of romantic and sexual tension between them, but nothing has really happened there.
Right.
And Denna is one of the most controversial characters. Can I say before I get into this?
Yes.
I am already getting anxious about the backlash for you're saying that you want another Kingkiller story and Patrick hasn't even finished book 3. It's okay, in my head this is after Patrick has written all of the Kingkiller Chronicle and he's now let me tell the story from another perspective. So with that throat clearing out of the way, Denna is one of the most controversial characters in fantasy, I would say. Just when you talk fantasy, which we do hear a lot on Friends Talking Fantasy.
We sure do.
Yes. If you talk about out in the Twitter sphere or social media, the name Denna immediately brings so many controversial opinions. It's probably the thing we get the most feedback about, I would say. Is that fair to say that our Denna takes are the thing we get the most feedback about?
It definitely leads to some of the more in-depth conversations with fans that just reach out to us. We end up the ones that we talk to the most back and forth. It's usually a Kingkiller conversation, usually a Denna conversation. I'd say that's fair.
Yeah. We've gotten several emails about Denna in particular.
Yeah.
We have moments where people see a Denna episode and they are immediately ooh, what is going on here? So, and they'll comment about it. There are also people who love Denna, like myself, and really have strong positive opinions about her. And a lot of people who reach out do as well. It's just this topic that is a very tough one or not tough one. It's just a very controversial one. And I think a lot of that comes from the fact that we don't see a lot of Denna's perspective. In fact, we see none of Denna's perspective. The whole thing is in Quoth's point of view. And Quoth, as we know, has this very, dare I say it, crooked or skewed perspective.
You dared to say
Denna.
it.
I dared to say it. Yes, we know Denna has a crooked nose. And Quoth, when he's Quoth recalling it, doesn't seem to mention that when he's describing her. And we have Bast come in and say oh, she had a crooked nose. And we get this sense that Quoth's perspective of Denna might not be entirely accurate because he's a human with subjective biases. And this is a person he has probably the strongest feelings for of anyone he discusses in his entire story. And when you're in your feelings about someone like Quoth is about Denna, there are going to be a lot of ways in which you present a biased perspective of that person's story. And we know there's a lot when it comes to Denna that is going on behind the scenes for her. When they first start interacting, Quoth and Denna, or at this point, Quoth and Denna, have this moment where they're just bonding, but there's also this piece of hey, we didn't talk to each other about our past at all because I got the sense from her that she has a really messed up past that she didn't want to talk about, and she got the sense from me probably that I have a really messed up past that I don't want to talk about at all either. And that is, we've talked a lot in other episodes about the difficulty those two have with vulnerability, but it also means that Quoth, at least to the point we've gotten to in the story so far, has no idea what all the stuff that's happened to Denna was and how it's affected her and how it makes her show up in particular ways. And she's such a mystery for us at this point in the story. We just see her as this person who comes in and out of Quoth's life at seemingly random but also seemingly suspicious points. And we also get this sense that she parallels Quoth in a lot of ways. There's a lot of speculation, including from myself, that Denna is basically the like a Quoth equivalent. But what happens when you're a girl and then a woman growing up in this world, which presents her with all sorts of difficulties that Quoth doesn't face, as well as a person who, for whatever reason, might have the Chandrian and the Aemir kind of reversed from the way that Quoth sees it. So Quoth obviously had his parents killed by the Chandrian, and he has been seeking vengeance, and he gets a sense that there's people, the Aemir, who oppose the Chandrian.
Right.
On the other side, we get the sense that Denna's perspective from the song that she sings to Quoth actually paints the Chandrian in a more heroic light. And that is very intriguing. And you start thinking, hey, maybe Denna has this whole backstory. I mean, almost definitely she has this whole backstory.
Yeah.
That
she's doing something when Quoth's not thinking about her.
Well, Quoth's thinking about her a lot, but when Quoth's not near her, she's definitely doing something.
Yes.
We get these moments like when we see her. She helps that in the Wise Man's Fear. She helps that poor girl who's super down on her luck, and she kind of gives her some hard truth talk, like, "Hey, yeah, your situation sucks, but here's the reality. Here's what you're gonna do, and I'm gonna help you." So, like, Denna's out there being the hero of her own story. She's doing some really, I think, if we're being charitable to her and assuming that she's just helping a person for the sake of helping them and she's not some like evil person behind the scenes, which I don't think she is, then like she's out there living her life. She's out there doing all these things and engaging in all these pursuits that are taking her coincidentally, or maybe not, to the same places as Quoth. And we just don't ever get to really know how she got there because all we hear is Quoth's side of the story. It's just like, oh, Denna's here. Like, that's great because I want to interact with her.
Right.
And what is she doing? That's the question on my mind. And she's such an interesting and complex and awesome character that I love reading about. And I just would love the opportunity to get her side of the story. And we'd also get the beautiful treat that would be Denna's perspective on Quoth.
That's what I was going to say. The beautiful treat of someone like observing Quoth without the Quoth that we know, the way that Quoth tells his own story about himself. And we get to see that compared to what other people see when they look at Quoth. And I think that alone, if this was a book, Rothfuss would like nail these scenes of where Denna like sees Quoth for the first time. It's like, oh, this mousy kid is sitting here being really quiet and he's like blumbling over his words and he's ratty looking and he's making all these mistakes. He's kind of arrogant, kind of annoying, like these are the things that people would pick up on that we can like extrapolate from what we know about the way the story's being told and the unreliable narration and all that, but we get to see in all of its glory through the perspective of the character that perhaps gets to know Quoth the most in depth, which is Denna. And
in some ways. And that is, to me, the second half of this that makes this spinoff so appealing. It's like, yes, we get to learn more about Denna and what she's doing, and there's so much potential for all the adventures that she could be going on. She's absent for a lot of the story, so there's a whole lot of stuff that she can be doing. And then we also get rewarded with these moments of when Quoth suddenly, seemingly randomly, pops into the picture. Yes.
And it's like, oh, like that's weird that he like hasn't come looking for me at all or hasn't asked about me or it's weird that he's been gone for so long. Like, the same thoughts mirrored from another perspective has so much potential to be a rewarding experience for us Kingkiller fans.
Right.
I think this spinoff is a fantastic idea.
Thanks, Charles. Yeah, I think about all these moments where all this Denna hate, I think a lot of times comes not all of it. Some of it, and it's okay if you hate Denna. We accept you anyway.
Yes.
We
totally
we
fine.
We don't hate Denna. We are big fans of Denna, but you can hate Denna, and it's cool. So but I think a lot of the reason why there is hate for Denna is because of these moments where we see Quoth searching for her, and where is she, and why is she always disappearing, and I'm spending so much time in Quoth's perspective and he's longing for her. Why can't she just be around? But when I've read the series a couple times at this point, and I've started to track how often is Denna looking for Quoth ideas of things, or at least we don't know how often Denna's looking for Quoth. That's part of what would make the spinoff awesome. But we do know that Denna seems to find Quoth more often than Quoth seems to find Denna. Mm-hmm. And she says things that indicate that she's looking for him constantly and not finding him. And I feel like she might be looking for him even more than he's looking for her. Mm-hmm. And then we also get these moments with Denna where it's like, she got stood up by Quoth on a date.
Yes.
That happened. We're in Quoth's perspective, and at least the way that Coat tells it, it's like, I saved this other woman from a fire, and then I just got knocked out, and I couldn't get to the date in time. Aren't I such a tragic hero? And we believe it. I do think that's what happened. And I don't want to crap on Quoth. I like Quoth a lot, and I understand why he is the way he is, given all his traumatic experiences, and I like him. But that being said, there are these moments where we know Quoth didn't show up for a date because he was busy being a tragic hero. Yeah. And from Denna's perspective, she just got stood up. Yeah. And I think that it's like, what does that do to our perception of Quoth when we're in Denna's perspective and she's just sitting there at this, wherever it was, like tavern, being like, I'm waiting for hours, and this guy who keeps telling me how much he cares about me is not showing up. I just think that stuff is happening constantly, and we know Quoth's side so well that we don't get what it would be like to be Denna interacting with Quoth. And I think that other perspective from someone who's I think Denna's very insightful. I think she's got a very good read on people. And I think she would just absolutely nail what Quoth is like in a way that, if you're a fan of the Kingkiller Chronicle and you like Quoth's perspective, I think Denna's perspective would be similarly like poetic and witty and all these things. It would just be another way to another perspective, another person.
It would be a really rewarding experience for us Kingkiller fans. It would shed so much light on what's going on with this narration and what's going on in Quoth's head versus what's going on in Denna's head, and just to get the other side of the story and what's happening at the same time, back by the school or in this other land, or, who is her patron, all these things that we might get to know more about that would recontextualize a lot of the Kingkiller in a very insightful way. And that to me is what would make a Denna spinoff so fantastic. Then, like you said, Denna's a great character in my opinion. I really enjoy Denna, and I think her perspective would be such a unique voice in the Kingkiller world. It would be so different from Quoth's, yet just as insightful. And it would be like a whole new experience. It would be so much fun, and that excites me. That's why I think it's a great idea. And I would definitely, we're thinking book for this, right?
Yeah, I was thinking a standalone book, but if there's enough story to tell, I would take at Rothfuss's current rate of writing. It would take some time to get out a whole new trilogy after he finishes the original Kingkiller Chronicle trilogy. So I almost, all of this is hypothetical anyway, but I just think if he could tell the story in a complete standalone, especially given that he's expecting that a lot of the background stuff that we would need to know, folks already know, by nature of having read the Kingkiller Chronicle.
Exactly.
I'm imagining a standalone book, maybe one of the Rothfuss style 1,000+ page standalone books or whatever, but one book and just tell us the Denna side of things. I think a lot of the mysteries of the Kingkiller Chronicle would be already solved. It's not like the plot is about like who is her patron. Like we're gonna, I think,
it would be like going back and identifying. Oh, that was a clue back at that moment. That was a clue when they were back in the name of the wind and saying these things. Or and Denna popped up in this scene. It implied that she had just come from this thing. Oh,
yes.
Like that's so interesting. Like you said, it recontextualizes these reveals that we're expecting from Kingkiller, and whether the theories that we have, talked about even in this episode of the Changeling and the Aemir prove true or not, it's something we can then go back both through Quoth's perspective and Denna's spin-off perspective and see how that was in the pages the whole time. And that would be a fun thing to read through as well.
Yeah, I mean, what is it like for Denna when she's sitting there watching Quoth break all those lute strings, and then she's trying to figure out if she wants to chime in with her verse, and she's like, is that the guy from the caravan thing? And she's working through all of that. I just think it'd be so cool to see. I mean, and I guess that's part of what I'm trying to say is like, these overlapping moments, though they would be the exception, not the rule, in the same way that most of the Kingkiller Chronicle is Quoth's story and Denna hops in from time to time. Mm-hmm. This Denna spinoff would be Denna's story, but the moments where they overlap, you'd get to see from Denna's perspective and get a whole new understanding of what that moment was like.
Exactly.
It's a different person, and they were on the other side of the thing that you only got Quoth's perspective.
Right. And it's a way to introduce new aspects of Denna's character. Yes. That Quoth was too self-indulgent to realize, or preoccupied to realize, whatever it is about Quoth that we can get and be like, oh, really? Denna thinks that way? Like, that's not the story. That's not the narrative we got from Quoth's side. There could be fun moments like that. I'm also picturing the moment where she decides to buy Quoth the really expensive loot case. Like, that comes out of nowhere in Quoth's perspective. It's like, this girl who, will they, won't they? I can't tell if she's into me. She disappears. She shows up and gives me this really expensive gift.
Right.
We need the other side to that. Like, that's an interesting idea where she's like, it's kind of extravagant, but, I like him and he's worth it and he'd love it so much. Like, all of these things. And then you could just hear Quoth, like, fumbling and closing it, and she might not tell if he even likes it or not. Like these kind of which would be interesting. I know it's emotional, but it's built on these scenes that Rothfuss had written, and it would bring some very insightful perspective into those moments. And there's so many of these moments, like you said, that could benefit from the full picture. And we get to see two sides of this love story versus one.
Yes, and when we see, Charles, the loot case moment is such a great one to bring up. That's part of why I'm glad we're doing spoilers here, because, like, So the loot case thing, if you take Quoth at his word for how much that costs, which I do, and how much of Denna's own money she must have thrown into that to make it happen, you get this sense that, oh my God, she did this really amazing thing for him. But to see Denna from her own perspective struggle to get all of that money, whatever she had to do, and I'm sure a lot of it was very unpleasant for her, given the sense we get of like what she has to do to make money in this world. Like she's going around with all these dudes, some of which do not treat her well, and I think that she's just worked really hard to get all that money, and to see her then spend it all on someone she cares about in Quoth, I think we would get this whole other level of appreciation for her that is hard to achieve when you just don't see the process behind what that must have been like for her. And I think a lot of the the journey, if you will, for Denna. Like, we just get a lot of destination with, like, oh, Denna was here, and then this happened. But if we get the journey with Denna and we take that alongside her, the empathy that we would build for her as readers, I think that it would be highly increased, and you might see a lot of people come around on Denna as a character if they didn't really like her to begin with. Because imagine how much compassion you'd have for a character that works so hard for all of that money and then spends it just on a completely, like, beneficent move to try to show someone she cares about them.
Right.
I don't know. I think, and we know why she struggles. So we know why Quoth struggles with vulnerability, and we just have this vague sense of, like, Denna also has a tough past, and we also get this sense of, like, her patron probably beats her, and that's probably hard. But we don't get to see that process. So I think that Rothfuss asks people to read between the lines a lot with Denna, and this would be a chance to actually read the lines rather than between them.
Right. No, that's exactly right, and it's well said. It's this idea that we need to build up some empathy for Denna, and that might change how we perceive her. And the way we get it from Quoth's story, just the nature of Quoth telling a story about himself and Denna someone that comes and goes in and out of it, we're not getting the full empathy of her journey, like you said. And to me, there's so much power in knowing that and seeing again how one life is affected by another and how they then go off living their life having known Quoth and see what they do and what they're thinking and how their behavior changes. And it brings new meaning to all these moments that have happened, like the loot case and like the singing in the tavern and all of those moments. So the campfire situation and what it was like seeing Quoth again after the campfire, it's like these are key moments that we all enjoy as readers that we're getting more insight into. Like, it's just exciting. So, great idea.
Yeah, and that moment where he croaks out that sort of, like, love me thing to her, that just heartbreaking, one of the last scenes in The Wise Man's Fear, where they after they go swimming and he returns her ring, and it's that cringeworthy moment from Quoth's perspective, and he's like, she must have just been so thrown off by that moment, and she must not, if she was into me before, she must not be into me now. And it's like, we get this situation after where Fella's, like, trying to explain what might have happened to Quoth, because he's just so in his feelings about Denna, it's hard for him to understand what's going on.
Right.
And Fell might have a better read. And we just get these moments of, like, what actually was going on for Denna in that moment. Maybe she was just taken aback by how much of a gesture it was, what Quoth did, and she didn't really know how to interact either. And kind of seeing Denna fumble and her awkwardness instead of just her external smoothness, I think would build empathy too.
I think, that scene I would love to read and just get a sense of what was going through her mind at the time. No, I think that's great, man. And unless you have more to add, I think we've done it too. Very exciting fantasy spin-off ideas. I would read either one of these in a heartbeat.
Yeah, I think it'll take a little bit more than a heartbeat to read the door stopper from Pat. No, I'm just kidding. I get you were saying you are excited about the ideas, and I'm excited about them too. And yeah, Charles, I'm pumped about. I think mine was. I'm not going to compare. I'm going to say that you had a really brilliant, creative idea, and I would be super excited by it, and I'd also be super excited by getting more Denna perspective. And I really enjoyed chatting with you about these. I felt like I got a whole nother perspective by hearing your hearing your spin-off idea, a whole new perspective on the Lord of the Rings. And it's always a pleasure taking this journey with you and having these fun conversations. That's what it's all about.
It's what it's all about. And Dylan, it was such a pleasure talking fantasy with you as well. I love talking Kingkiller so much. And very few people that I know that exist in this world are as insightful when it comes to the topic of Denna and Quoth as you. So being able to revisit this conversation, focusing on potentially Denna's backstory and empathy and how that delivers on the story that we know and love from Kingkiller, that's... We talk about Kingkiller so much, but it's still a new perspective, a new way to think about the series, and I think that's just great. And I think we got a winner here with this new segment.
I agree, Charles.
I'm
excited because I didn't know how long we would go on these when we were first talking through it, but I'm feeling like. So I came up with a bunch, is what I'm trying to say. I came up with a bunch of different ideas, and I was happy to see that there was enough conversation to be had about just two to fill like an hour of conversation. So I think that I have a lot of other fun ideas, things from The First Law, maybe. Things from...
I love The First Law.
Things from Kings of the Wild by Nicholas Eames. And,
wow.
That one's actually something that he talked about. But it's a tease. It's a tease.
It's a tease, guys. We're teasing it. Well, as long as we'll see how it goes, fan reaction. But I'm excited. I think this was a great idea. And honestly, now I don't think there's anything left to do but to play the outro music. What do you say, Dylan?
Let's get that sweet, sweet outro music pumping, and maybe we can get our pipes like Quoth.
Oh, let's get those pipes out. Get that loop going. Here we go. Thank you all so much for listening to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast. This has been your co-host, Charles and Dylan. If you like what you heard today and you want to continue the conversation, reach out to us over on Twitter at the FTF Podcast with a number 1 at the end. And we are also on Instagram at the FTF Podcast. That's got a 1 on the end of it too, right?
Wait, which one? Instagram?
Instagram. There's no 1 at the end of Instagram.
There's no 1.
Only Twitter has the 1. I forgot there for a second. I've only done this 120 times. So
no one can be on every time. You're doing it, Charles.
I appreciate you getting me through this one. But Dylan, now, if they like what they heard today, they follow us on Twitter at the FTF Podcast with number 1 at the end. They follow us on Instagram at the FTF Podcast, no number 1 at the end. And they want to support the show even further, and they just so happen to be listening on Apple Podcasts. What can they do?
Toss 5 stars to our podcast. Just find that Friends Talking Fantasy page on the Apple Podcast app. Click it, the Friends Talking Fantasy thing, and then scroll down past all those episodes until you start seeing stars. Once you're seeing stars, the optimal number of stars to click in order to support the show would be 5 of them. If you have a little bit of extra time, then writing a review is even more helpful for a podcast like ours, but just listening is more than enough.
Guys,
thank you
just
so
listening,
much.
More than enough. Thank you so much. And as always, go forth and conquer, friends.